The autumn wind carried the scent of dying leaves through the dusty streets of Cedar Falls, a town where compassion had grown as scarce as water in a drought. 70-year-old Henry Caldwell shuffled slowly along the wooden sidewalk, his worn boots making barely a whisper against the weathered planks. His clothes, once the fine attire of a respected businessman, now hung like rags on his gaunt frame, telling the story of a man who had lost everything to circumstances beyond his control. Henry's stomach cramped with a hunger so fierce it felt like wild animals clawing at his insides. He pressed a trembling hand against his belly, trying to quiet the growling that seemed to echo through the empty spaces inside him. 3 days had passed since his last real meal, and his body was beginning to betray him in ways that filled him with shame. His vision blurred occasionally, forcing him to pause and steady himself against whatever wall or post was nearest. The old man remembered better days with painful clarity, days when he owned the largest grain mill in 3 counties and employed half the men in Cedar Falls. His wife Margaret had been alive then, filling their grand house with laughter and the smell of fresh bread baking in her kitchen. They had been pillars of the community, generous with their fortune and quick to help anyone in need. The irony of his current situation was not lost on him. But the drought of 1887 had changed everything. Crops failed across the territory. Farmers couldn't pay their debts, and Henry's mill sat silent for months at a time. Then Margaret took sick with consumption, and the medical bills consumed what little savings remained. The bank foreclosed on everything: the mill, the house, even Margaret's jewelry that had been her grandmother's. Within 6 months, Henry had gone from being one of the wealthiest men in the territory to sleeping in abandoned buildings and begging for scraps. Now, as he approached Jameson's bakery, the smell of fresh bread nearly brought him to his knees. The aroma was torture and temptation combined, reminding him of everything he'd lost while taunting him with what he desperately needed but could never afford. His mouth watered uncontrollably, and he had to wipe saliva from the corners of his mouth with a shaking hand. Henry stood outside the bakery for nearly 10 minutes, gathering courage for what he knew would be another humiliation. Through the window, he could see Mrs. Jameson arranging loaves on wooden shelves, her movements efficient and practiced. She had been a customer of his mill for years, had always greeted him warmly at church social gatherings. Surely she would remember their past relationship, would show mercy to a man who had once been her social equal. Taking a deep breath that rattled in his chest, Henry pushed open the bakery door. The little bell above jingled cheerfully, a sound that once would have brought him joy, but now felt like an announcement of his shame. Mrs. Jameson looked up from her work, and Henry saw the exact moment recognition dawned in her eyes, followed immediately by a look of disgust that cut him deeper than any physical wound. "What do you want?" she asked coldly, her voice carrying none of the warmth it had held in better days. "I told you before, I don't have anything for beggars. This is a respectable establishment." Henry's cheeks burned with embarrassment, but desperation made him persistent. "Please, Mrs. Jameson," he said quietly, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Just a small piece of bread. Even day-old bread would be a blessing. I'm not asking for charity, just help from one human being to another." Her face hardened further, and she moved closer to the counter as if his poverty might be contagious. "You have some nerve coming in here," she hissed. "After what you did to this town, after all the people who lost their jobs when your mill failed. My own nephew was one of your workers, and now he's had to move his family to Denver looking for work." The accusation hit Henry like a physical blow. He had carried the guilt of his workers' fate for months, knowing that his failure had cost good men their livelihoods. But the drought and economic collapse had been beyond anyone's control. He tried to explain, but Mrs. Jameson cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Get out," she said, her voice rising. "Get out before I call Sheriff Morrison. We don't need your kind bringing down the reputation of decent businesses." Henry backed toward the door, his heart breaking a little more with each step. "Please," he whispered one more time, "I'm so hungry. I just need—" "Out!" Mrs. Jameson shouted, and the sound brought several people to the bakery windows, their faces pressed against the glass to witness his humiliation. As Henry stumbled out of the bakery, he nearly collided with Big Jim Patterson, a man who had once worked in his mill, but now served as one of Sheriff Morrison's deputies. Jim was built like a mountain, with hands the size of dinner plates, and a temperament that had grown meaner since losing his job. His eyes lit up with recognition and something that looked disturbingly like pleasure. "Well, well," Jim said loudly, his voice carrying across the street. "If it isn't the great Henry Caldwell, begging for scraps like a mangy dog. How the mighty have fallen." Henry tried to move past the larger man, but Jim stepped sideways, blocking his path. A crowd was beginning to gather, drawn by the promise of entertainment at the old man's expense. Henry recognized many faces in the growing circle, people who had once tipped their hats to him respectfully, who had sought his advice on business matters, who had celebrated at his table during happier times. "I just want to go," Henry said quietly, his voice barely audible above the murmur of the crowd. "Oh, but we're just getting reacquainted," Jim said with a grin that showed too many teeth. "Tell me, old man, what's it like to lose everything? What's it like to go from giving orders to begging for breadcrumbs?" The crowd laughed, and the sound was like broken glass grinding into Henry's soul. He could see the mixture of amusement and contempt in their faces, the way they looked at him like he was something less than human. These were people he had helped in the past, people whose children he had given jobs to, people whose church he had supported with generous donations. "Please," Henry said again, hating how weak and desperate he sounded. "I don't want any trouble. I'll just move along." But Jim was enjoying himself too much to let the entertainment end so quickly. "You know what I think?" he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "I think maybe you need to be reminded of your place in this world. I think maybe you need to learn some respect." Before Henry could react, Jim's massive fist crashed into his stomach, doubling him over and sending him gasping to his knees in the dust. The crowd cheered, as if they were watching a prize fight instead of the beating of a starving old man. Pain exploded through Henry's thin body, and he tasted blood in his mouth. "That's for all the good men you put out of work," Jim said, punctuating his words with a kick to Henry's ribs that sent the old man sprawling. "And that's for thinking you can come into decent establishments and beg like some kind of animal." Henry curled into a ball as more blows rained down, protecting his head as best he could while the crowd cheered Jim on. Through the haze of pain, he wondered if this was how it would end, beaten to death in the street like a rabid dog, while the people he had once called neighbors watched and laughed. But then, through the chaos and pain, he heard a young voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Stop it, stop hurting him." 12-year-old Thomas Fletcher pushed through the circle of adults, his small frame trembling with righteous anger as he placed himself between Big Jim Patterson and the beaten old man curled in the dust. Thomas was small for his age, thin from too many missed meals, but his green eyes blazed with a fury that made several adults step back in surprise. His clothes were patched and mended, marking him as one of the poorer children in town. But his voice carried an authority that seemed to come from somewhere deep within his young soul. "Get away from him!" Thomas shouted, his fists clenched at his sides as he faced down the mountain of a man who towered over him like a giant. "He's just a hungry old man. What kind of people are you?" Big Jim laughed, but there was something uncomfortable about the sound, now that a child had interrupted his entertainment. "Well, look what we have here," he said, his voice dripping with mock amusement. "Little Tommy Fletcher defending the town beggar. Your daddy know you're out here making friends with his kind?" The mention of his father brought a flash of pain across Thomas's face, quickly replaced by even fiercer determination. "My daddy's dead," he said simply, "and if he were alive, he'd be ashamed of every one of you for standing here watching this happen." A murmur went through the crowd at the boys' words. Many of them remembered Thomas's father, a decent man who had died in a mill accident the previous spring, leaving his son to fend for himself with only an elderly aunt who could barely take care of herself. The boy had been working odd jobs around town ever since, earning just enough to keep himself and his aunt from starving. Thomas knelt beside Henry, his young hands gentle as they assessed the damage. The old man's face was bruised and swollen, blood trickled from his nose, and he was breathing in short, painful gasps that suggested at least one broken rib. But it was the look in Henry's eyes that broke Thomas's heart, a look of complete defeat and abandonment that no human being should ever have to wear. "It's okay, sir," Thomas said softly, his voice now carrying the kind of compassion that seemed impossibly mature for someone so young. "You're going to be all right. I won't let them hurt you anymore." Big Jim's face darkened at being defied by a child in front of the entire town. "You'd better step aside, boy, before you find yourself in the same condition as your new friend." "Here, this ain't your concern." "It is my concern," Thomas said, rising to face the bigger man again. "It's everyone's concern when we let innocent people get beaten in our streets. What's next? Are you going to start beating women and children too? Where does it end?" The crowd was growing uncomfortable now, the boys' words forcing them to confront the ugliness of what they had been watching with such entertainment. Several people began to drift away, no longer finding the situation amusing. But Jim was too invested now to back down, his reputation as a tough man at stake in front of the entire community. "Last warning, kid," Jim said, raising his hand threateningly. "Get out of here before I teach you the same lesson I taught your friend." Instead of backing down, Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small cloth bundle, carefully wrapped and tied with string. Inside was half a loaf of bread, some cheese, and an apple, his own meal that he had been saving for later in the day. He had worked all morning chopping wood for Mrs. Henderson to earn the money for this food, and it represented his only guaranteed meal. "Here," Thomas said, kneeling again beside Henry and pressing the bundle into the old man's shaking hands. "You need this more than I do." Henry stared at the food in amazement, then up at the boy's face. I can't take your meal, son. You're just a child yourself. You need this food, and you need it more," Thomas said firmly. "Besides, I can always find more work, earn another meal. But right now, you need help, and this is what I have to give." The simplicity and purity of the gesture struck the remaining crowd like a physical force. Here was a child, barely more than a beggar himself, giving away his own food to help a stranger in need. The contrast between Thomas's compassion and their own cruelty was stark and undeniable. Big Jim, feeling his authority challenged by a child's moral superiority, reached down to snatch the food away. "That old fool doesn't deserve charity," he snarled, "especially not from some orphan brat who should know his place." But as Jim's hand closed around the bundle, Thomas grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "No," the boy said quietly, "this is wrong, and you know it. We all know it." The physical contact between the child and the much larger man created a moment of perfect silence, as if the entire world was holding its breath. In that silence, the moral weight of the situation became impossible to ignore. A hungry child was defending a beaten old man, giving away his own food while adults stood by and watched or actively participated in cruelty. Dr. Sarah Mitchell pushed through the crowd at that moment, her medical bag in hand, and her face flushed with anger and professional urgency. She was one of the few female doctors in the territory, a woman who had fought for her education and her right to practice medicine in a man's world. Her reputation for treating anyone regardless of their ability to pay had made her beloved by the poor and respected even by those who disapproved of women in professional roles. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, taking in the scene at a glance. Her trained eye immediately assessed Henry's injuries, while her moral sense recoiled at what had obviously taken place. Who did this to this man? The crowd suddenly found other places to look, their enthusiasm for the entertainment evaporating in the face of Dr. Mitchell's professional authority and moral outrage. Big Jim released his grip on the food bundle and stepped back, but his face showed no remorse. "He's just a beggar, Doc," Jim said defensively. "Was causing trouble at the bakery, bothering decent folks. Sometimes you got to teach people their place." Dr. Mitchell's eyes blazed with fury. His place is the same as any other human being's. He has a right to ask for help without being beaten half to death in the street. She knelt beside Henry, her hands beginning their professional assessment of his injuries. "This man needs immediate medical attention. Help me get him to my office." "Nobody's helping that old fool," Jim said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. The presence of the doctor and the boy's courage had shifted the dynamic completely. Thomas stood up, still holding the food bundle, and looked directly at Big Jim. "You're wrong," he said simply. "And deep down, you know you're wrong. My daddy always told me that how we treat the weakest among us shows what kind of people we really are. What does this show about you? Subscribe to our channel now to see how this incredible story of courage and compassion continues to unfold. Don't miss what happens next in this powerful tale." The boy's words hung in the air like a judgment, and Big Jim's face grew red with a mixture of anger and something that might have been shame. Several people in the remaining crowd nodded their heads, Thomas's simple wisdom cutting through their earlier bloodlust to reach whatever conscience they still possessed. The silence stretched uncomfortably as everyone waited to see how the confrontation would resolve. Dr. Mitchell worked quickly and efficiently, her practiced hands checking Henry's pulse and examining his injuries with the kind of professional competence that commanded respect even from those who questioned her right to practice medicine. "This man has at least 2 broken ribs and possibly a concussion," she announced to the crowd. "He needs immediate care, and he needs it now. I'll help you carry him, Dr. Mitchell," Thomas said immediately, moving to Henry's other side despite his small size. His willingness to help, combined with his earlier defense of the old man, created a stark contrast to the adults who had either participated in or watched the beating with entertainment. "Son, you're barely big enough to carry yourself, Doctor," Mitchell said gently, "but I appreciate the offer more than you know." "Then I'll find people who will help," Thomas said with determination. He looked around at the faces in the crowd, many of whom were now avoiding his direct gaze. Surely there are still some decent people in this town who remember what it means to help a neighbor in need. His words carried the weight of a challenge, and several men shifted uncomfortably. Among them was Pastor Williams from the Methodist Church, a man who preached about Christian charity every Sunday, but had stood silently watching the beating. The contradiction between his preaching and his inaction was now impossible to ignore, especially with a child calling out the moral failure of the adult community. "I'll help," Pastor Williams said quietly, stepping forward and clearly struggling with his own conscience. "Thomas is right. We've forgotten what we're supposed to stand for." His admission seemed to break the spell that had held the crowd in moral paralysis. One by one, other men stepped forward to offer assistance. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the boarding house, announced that she would prepare a room where Henry could recover. Even some of those who had earlier laughed at his beating now seemed eager to make amends for their behavior. But Big Jim wasn't finished. His reputation was at stake, and he couldn't let a child and an old woman make him look like a fool in front of the entire town. "You people are making a mistake," he said, his voice taking on a threatening edge. "Start helping every beggar and drifter who comes through town, and we'll be overrun with their kind. Sometimes you got to be hard to protect what you've built." Thomas looked up at him with eyes that seemed far too old for his young face. "What have we built, Mr. Patterson? A town where we beat old men for being hungry? A town where children have to teach adults how to show mercy? Is that really something worth protecting?" The questions hit their mark, and Jim's face contorted with rage. "You little brat," he snarled, raising his hand as if to strike the boy. "Someone needs to teach you to keep your mouth shut and show respect to your betters." But before he could act on his threat, a strong hand caught his wrist in a grip that made him wince. Sheriff Morrison had arrived, drawn by reports of a disturbance, and his face showed none of the tolerance he usually showed for his deputy's aggressive behavior. "That's enough, Jim," the sheriff said quietly, but his tone carried absolute authority. "More than enough." "Sheriff, this boy was interfering with official business," Jim protested, trying to justify his actions. "I was maintaining order, keeping the peace." "By beating an old man half to death?" Sheriff Morrison asked, his voice cold with disgust. "By threatening to hit a child? That's your idea of keeping the peace." The sheriff was a fair man who had grown increasingly uncomfortable with Big Jim's methods over the past few months. This guy. Deputy's tendency toward excessive force had generated complaints from several townspeople, but this public display of cruelty toward a defenseless old man was beyond acceptable. "Jim, you're relieved of duty," Sheriff Morrison said, his words carrying across the crowd. "Turn in your badge." "You can't do this to me," Jim exploded. "I've been your deputy for 3 years. I've kept this town safe from drifters and troublemakers." "Safe?" Thomas interjected, his young voice cutting through Jim's protests. "How are we safe when the people who are supposed to protect us are the ones we need protection from?" The boy's logic was unassailable, and even Jim seemed to realize that his position had become untenable. With a curse that made several ladies in the crowd gasp, he stripped off his badge and threw it in the dust at Sheriff Morrison's feet before stalking away, muttering threats under his breath. With Jim's departure, the atmosphere changed completely. Dr. Mitchell directed the volunteers in carefully lifting Henry and carrying him to her office, while Thomas walked alongside, still clutching the bundle of food he had tried to give the old man. The procession had an almost ceremonial quality, as if the entire town was participating in an act of collective redemption. At the doctor's office, Henry was settled onto an examination table where Dr. Mitchell could work on his injuries properly. His consciousness drifted in and out, but during his lucid moments he kept looking at Thomas with wonder and gratitude that went beyond words. "Why?" Henry whispered when Thomas leaned close to check on him. "Why did you help me? You don't even know me." Thomas considered the question seriously before answering. "My daddy always said that we're all connected, that helping others is the same as helping ourselves. Besides," he added with a small smile, "you looked like you needed a friend." The simplicity of the answer brought tears to Henry's eyes. In all his years of business success and social standing, he had rarely encountered such pure kindness. It had taken losing everything for him to discover what really mattered in life. As Dr. Mitchell worked on Henry's injuries, word of what had happened spread throughout Cedar Falls. The story grew in the telling, but the essential elements remained the same. A child had shown more courage and compassion than any of the adults, defending a helpless old man and shaming an entire community into remembering their better nature. By evening, a steady stream of visitors had come to Dr. Mitchell's office. Some brought food, others offered Henry temporary shelter, and a few even brought job opportunities for when he recovered. Mrs. Jameson from the bakery arrived with tears in her eyes and a basket of fresh bread, apologizing profusely for her earlier cruelty. "I don't know what came over me," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "You were always good to us when you had your mill. I had no right to treat you that way." Henry accepted her apology graciously, his own capacity for forgiveness proving as large as his physical needs were small. "We all make mistakes when times are hard," he said gently. "What matters is that we learn from them." As the sun set over, Cedar Falls. Thomas sat beside Henry's bed, finally eating the meal he had tried to give away earlier. The old man insisted on sharing it, and they ate together in comfortable silence. Two souls who had found friendship in the most unlikely circumstances. "You saved my life today," Henry said eventually. "Not just from the beating, but from something much worse. You reminded me that there's still goodness in the world." Thomas smiled, his young face glowing with the satisfaction of knowing he had done the right thing. "And you reminded everyone else too," he said. "Sometimes people just need someone to show them the way." Outside the window, the lights of Cedar Falls twinkled in the darkness, but the town seemed somehow brighter than it had that morning, as if a child's courage had lit a flame that would burn long after this day was forgotten. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to follow more amazing stories of courage, compassion, and redemption from the Old West. Hit that subscribe button now and join our community.